Hi, my name's Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through some question predictions for the first two exams of Edexcel A-Level Politics for this year, some final advice on how to revise and prepare, and how to answer the questions and how you should be approaching your kind of introductions, evaluation, etc. And finally, I'm going to go through 12 key examples that you can use from the last year in the exam. These examples are from some example packs, recent example packs that have just been released on the Politics Explained website. It says 72 examples for UK politics, which you can see here, as well as 77 for UK government. Which you can also see here. So we're going to go through 12 of the key ones, but if you want to see all of them, and they'll be really, really useful for the first exam, you can find them on the Politics Explained website, where you can also find loads of resources to help you with those first two exams and your third exam as well. So what you can find is detailed essay plans for UK politics and UK government, everything you need to know guides and notes on like full, effectively updated textbooks on UK politics, UK government, and for core ideologies, we've also got the textbook and also 12 core ideologies plans. So looking at liberalism, conservatism, and socialism, on state, the economy, society, and human nature, which should be really, really useful for the exam. So yeah, go to the Politics Explained website to find all of those, which should help you in the exam. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to have a look at is some predictions for this year's exams. And this was all from a newsletter I sent out to all subscribers a few weeks ago. The key first thing to emphasise is that anything on the specification can come up in the exams, and you should definitely revise everything. But it is useful to have an understanding of what's more or less likely to come up based on exams in recent years. So in terms of paper one, a few topics that are less likely to come up due to coming up last year are referendums, democratic deficit, and party funding. So these are three relatively small topics that you can expect to likely not come up this year because they came up last year. As I said, that doesn't mean they won't come up. They can definitely come up, but I probably wouldn't prioritise loads of revision time focusing on them, though I would make sure that you could answer a question on all of them if it did come up. Everything else, I'd say, in terms of the UK politics, is as likely, and in terms of ideologies and UK politics, is as likely as anything else to come up. So your kind of voting behaviour, electoral system, political parties, pressure groups, rights and contests, they're all as likely as each other to come up, and they could all definitely come up. But there are a few topics that I have a hunch are kind of likely to come up, given kind of the fact they haven't come up last year or in recent years, and it's kind of their turn to come up. So the first one of those is the media, and that could be as part of a voting behaviour question, such as evaluate the view that the media is the most important factor influencing voting behaviour in the UK, or it could be a kind of a question about the media on its own, something like evaluate the view that the role of the media in politics is exaggerated, or evaluate the view that the media has little impact in UK politics. And obviously for those two different types of questions, there is a different structure. So for the first one, in terms of influence on voter behaviour, you'd be comparing it with other factors that influence voting behaviour. So you do media versus three other factors in 3 paragraphs. So media versus leadership, media versus policy, media versus social factors in terms of influences on voting behaviour. In the second one, you could do a range of different things. You could look at different types of media as the themes. One way I think is a really good way to do it is to look at the role of the media in influencing election outcomes and voting behaviour, the role of the media in holding the government to account between elections, and then you can just do a 2-paragraph structure for that one, make them more detailed, also have more analysis and evaluation, or you could also have one on kind of the role of the media in undermining democracy as a third one. And what's really important with the media is recognising the different question types and what they're looking for. So recognising when it's a voting behaviour question and you need to bring in the different factors, but also recognising when it's not and you want to bring in stuff about, okay, the media's impact between elections as well. Next thing that I think is quite likely to come up, especially as being very topical in the last couple of years with the Conservative government increasingly passing a number of reforms that have gone against rights, is rights in context. Hasn't come up in a while. And the kind of question you can expect for this is something like evaluate the view that rights are effectively protected in the UK, or evaluate the view that individual and collective rights are poorly protected in the UK, something like that. And you'll see in the UK politics essay plans, the key kind of structure I recommend for this one is a 3-theme structure. For most of these questions, obviously different questions on it might call for different structures, but the general question, are rights effectively protected? You want to have a kind of, I'd recommend kind of 3 themes, a paragraph on how pressure groups protect rights, for and against, a paragraph on how the Supreme Court and the Human Rights Act protect rights, including declarations of incompatibility, and including especially the recent Rwanda example, Safety of Rwanda Bill, which I'll talk about a bit later in the video. And then the final one on the government and parliament, so in particular how they can pass legislation to protect rights, but crucially with the recent Conservative governments, how they can pass laws such as the Public Order Act, which we're going to go through, that actually threaten rights, especially the right to protest in the UK. Next key topic that I think is very likely to come up is electoral systems. So this could be a question just on first past the post, or it could be a question comparing it to another devolved system, so AMS, STV, or it could be a more general question on the impact of the systems on things like voting behaviour, type of government created, strong government, or voter choice. Often, what really works well for these questions, you'll need to judge it by the question, but say it's a question like evaluate the view that first past post is not the most effective electoral system in use in the UK. Having 3 criteria is a really good way to answer this as your themes. So that would be crucially type of government created, and you'd look at arguments that they create a strong government, first past the post does, and coalitions don't. And obviously there's some kind of counterpoints to that as well. Also representation and proportionality as one paragraph, where you can bring in stuff about the MP constituency link and proportionality, and how that compares to other systems which are arguably a lot more, well, not arguably, they are a lot more proportional and a lot more representative. And then finally, voter choice is a really important one. Obviously, looking at in first place, you only get 1 vote, but also tactical voting, or how it leads to tactical voting, lots of wasted votes, inequality in whether votes matter between different voters based on the size of the constituency, but also whether they're a safe seat or a marginal seat. And obviously comparing that to the other systems where you get more than 1 vote, where you can rank your choices and therefore properly reflect your political preferences and know that it's going to have an impact on the outcome. So lots of different questions you get for electoral systems, definitely worth having a look at those. Labour Party and Conservative Party, the main parties haven't come up yet in the most recent kind of version of Edexcel A-level politics, and it's effectively their time to come up. And I think there's a lot of very topical questions that could come up at the moment. So this could be on just the Labour Party, and then the key questions in relation to this are probably going to be in relation to current policy and the extent to which it's similar to old Labour or new Labour. Something like evaluating the view that the current Labour Party policy is closer to new Labour than old Labour. Could be a really good question, or reflects new Labour. For the Conservative Party, you could get a similar question, but it's more likely to be kind of, to what extent is it still Thatcherite? Could have one nation, but it's more likely to be Thatcherite, in my opinion. And then you could also get one comparing the parties, and this could be on a couple of things. You could get evaluate the view that the Labour Party and Conservative Party policies are more similar than they are dissimilar. I think that could be a really good question. So the extent of similarity between the party policies. You get one on factions in the party. So evaluate the view that Labour Party is more divided than the Conservative Party is. I think that one's a bit less likely, but could definitely come up. There's obviously lots of other kind of types of configurations, the questions that could come up. But I think those key ones, if you prepare those kind of 4 questions, so Labour Party, to what extent is it still New Labour or Old Labour, or closer to New Labour than Old Labour? Conservative Party, to what extent is it closer to Thatcherism? And comparing the parties, are they more similar or dissimilar? And the final one, which party's more divided? I think if you know those really well, you're very, very well prepared and can pretty much answer any question. 3 of those, the first 3, so not the one about the factions, are in the UK Politics Essay Plans on the Politics Explained website. If you want to see how I've answered those, they're all updated for this year's exams. Effectively, for those first 3 questions, so Labour Party, Conservative Party, and then comparison in terms of policies, it is actually a relatively simple structure. You just do it in terms of themes, in terms of types of policy. So you always want to be starting with economic policy because it's no doubt the most important. And the other ones you can have a bit of flexibility. So I think what works really well is often foreign policy, and you can combine that with immigration, particularly for comparing the parties. They're quite similar on foreign policy in a lot of areas. The key difference is on immigration, and particularly in relation to the Rwanda policy. And then the other one you can have kind of law and order, often works really well, specifically for kind of Labour Party and Conservative Party, actually, because if you look at Thatcherism and New Labour, and law and order was really key. Or you could look at welfare, unions, various combinations of those. So just kind of pick 3 types of policy and then analyse the kind of similarities and differences or arguments from either side within those areas of policy, which actually makes what can be quite difficult, complicated questions on UK politics a little bit easier if you structure it like that. In terms of the core political ideas, Conservatism is the most likely to come up, I think, because it didn't come up last year. But I think any of them could come up. Theoretically, they could do two questions on one political idea, so just on socialism or just on conservatism, just on liberalism. I think that is pretty unlikely. And I've seen some people saying they're not going to revise one ideology or just focus on conservatism, which I really don't recommend. I don't think you should not revise socialism. I think you should be revising all of them. Not only because they could ask two questions on one, I think that's quite unlikely, but the more important reason is that if you get two questions and you're just revising conservatism, and the conservative question is really difficult, and they put a socialism question in there that's really easy, and you know if you'd revised it, you'd be able to do a really good answer for it. You don't want to be kind of forcing yourself to do that really difficult conservatism question that you're going to ultimately get less marks on and do less well in. So definitely revise all of them. I think conservatism is definitely the most likely to come up, and you should definitely know that very well. But socialism and liberalism, I think, are almost as likely as each other to come up, and you should be revising all three of them. So that's predictions for the first exam. In terms of looking at paper 2, so there's a bit kind of less useful predictions in terms of this one. Less likely to come up due to coming up last year, I'd say, is codification of the Constitution. Quite a small topic that they're unlikely to do 2 years in a row. I'd say almost everything else is as likely as anything else to come up. But there are a few topics I have a hunch may come up, so these also based on stuff that hasn't come up yet, or it's time to come up. Sovereignty, I think, can definitely come up. So there you're looking at questions: to what extent is Parliament still sovereign? Again, all of these plans are in the UK government essay plans on politics explained website. Very detailed if you want to have a look at them. Now, for that sovereignty question, you're kind of looking at, okay, what ways can Parliament be able to be not sovereign versus still sovereign? You can look at devolved bodies is a really key one. You can look at leaving the European Union and how that influenced parliamentary sovereignty. The people, so in terms of both referendums and the idea of popular sovereignty compared to the legal sovereignty of parliamentary sovereignty, and you kind of effectively do it in terms of themes like that. And you could also look at, if you want to, you could also look at rights in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has kind of taken away parliamentary sovereignty, particularly in relation to declarations of incompatibility, and you can make a lot of good arguments on either side for that. And you can also look at the idea of executive sovereignty and elective dictatorship. So I think sovereignty is quite a likely question, and that could be combined with the European Union or a question kind of on European Union on its own. So the key kind of type of question you're likely to get on the European Union is the impact of leaving the EU on parliamentary sovereignty in the UK. So you could get something like, evaluate the view that leaving the European Union did not significantly increase parliamentary sovereignty. And it's quite a difficult question, but there's effectively, you look at the key ways it has increased parliamentary sovereignty, and that's the UK government and Parliament, can now make laws on any subject. There's also now no longer a higher court that can strike down laws passed by the UK Parliament. And you can also talk about a number of the cases during the Brexit process which increased parliamentary sovereignty, so Miller 1 and Miller 2 in particular. The kind of counterpoints for that are Parliament's still not completely sovereign over Northern Ireland due to the Windsor Framework and the Northern Ireland Protocol. You can also look at the fact that a lot of the powers that have been regained have been exercised by the government, not by Parliament. And though that's technically still parliamentary sovereignty, you can link it into arguments for executive sovereignty and elective dictatorship. So, for example, trade policy has been regained from the EU, but that's largely controlled by the government. So can we say that Parliament's really much more sovereign? Possibly not. And you can also look at arguments about pooled sovereignty, that the pooled sovereignty of being in the EU has been lost. So I think that's definitely a question that come up, a very difficult one, but not something that's like the European Union isn't a topic that's just never going to come up again because we've left the EU. It definitely can come up, particularly in relation to its impact on parliamentary sovereignty. And as I said, that could also be a kind of question that spans that and the sovereignty topic. So you could get a question phrased slightly differently. Evaluate the view that leaving the European Union, but after leaving the European Union, Parliament is now sovereign. And I think for that, you wouldn't want to just talk about the EU. You'd probably do a paragraph on the EU. So those key arguments that no longer a higher court can pass laws on any subject, and then the counterpoints in terms of Northern Ireland, counterpoints in terms of executive sovereignty. But then you'd also want to look at devolved bodies, because is Parliament still sovereign? That's very relevant, right? And some of the other, and maybe one of the other factors as well. So that's where you maybe frame it slightly differently. Have a look at the UK government essay plans it goes through. You'll see those in detail as examples of that. Ministerial responsibility, I think, is relatively likely to come up. PM and the cabinet could easily come up as well as part of that kind of PM and the executive topic. It's not like ministerial responsibility is definitely going to come up. But yeah, and it's a relatively easy one to revise for, because there's not too many questions that get asked about whether ministerial responsibility is still important. They could confine it just to individual, and then you probably do a 2-paragraph structure looking at individual in relation to personal conduct, individual in relation to responsibility for the department, or they could do it collective and individual. Are they both still important? Do they still both still apply? And then you could do it too. You could do one on collective, one on individual, or I think what often works really well is one on individual ministerial responsibility in relation to personal conduct, one on individual ministerial responsibility in relation to responsibility for the department, and one on collective ministerial responsibility. There's a few really good recent examples in relation to that as well, which you can find in the updated example packs I mentioned at the start of the video. So in relation to Suella Braverman, in relation to Gillian Keegan as Education Secretary, not resigning in relation to the kind of concrete scandal. And there are a couple of examples of, for example, Zach Goldsmith resigning as an example of acceptance of collective ministerial responsibility. So have a look at those, make sure you know those well. Another final topic I think could definitely come up is kind of constitutional changes since 1997. So that's looking at, okay, the changes that were introduced by Blair's government and how much impact they had. So you could talk about, okay, did they have a positive impact on democracy? Were they significant? And for those, if it just talks specifically about Blair's reforms, you probably want to look at 3 topics that often work. And this is how I do it in the plans. Are the Human Rights Act as 1 paragraph, House of Lords reform as 1 paragraph, and devolution as 1 paragraph. And I think that also works if it's a slightly different question on should the Constitution be further reformed, or should these reforms be taken further? And you look at those 3 topics as well. Particularly, you can bring in stuff from Starmer in the last couple of years in relation to his proposed reforms in relation to the House of Lords. In particular, you could also get one more generally, not just Blair's reforms. You also just get like constitutional change, and idea should there be constitutional change, in that you can bring in codification of the Constitution a little bit, and maybe have that devolution and House of Lords reform could work. There's lots of different ways you could do it. But you could also get one on constitutional changes since 2010, which is a bit more of a different question. For there, look at the plans again, but you're kind of probably looking at Brexit as 1 paragraph. Further devolution as 1 paragraph. There's been quite a lot of further devolution in the last couple of years. Have a look at the UK government example pack. For that one, I'll go through one of the examples today, but you've seen kind of trailblazer deals in English devolution in particular. So I think English devolution now covers 90% of the north and 64% of the whole of England. So significant further control, and there was also further control given to Wales and Scotland since 2010. And you can also look at parliamentary reform, so things like the Recall of MPs Act, Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which is actually now being removed. And there's one final one. I can't seem to remember. It's in the plan. Have a look at it. English votes for English laws, I think was the final one, which has also been scrapped since. But yeah, just reiterating with this and with paper 1, anything can come up. So I'm not saying just revise these. Definitely don't. Make sure you know these questions really well, because they're likely to come up, and these topics really well. But you should 100% be knowing everything. What I'm going to have a quick look at now is just and it's probably quite late for the first exam, but should hopefully help still, and for the second exam as well. What's the best way to revise? For me, essay planning and essay writing is one of the best ways to revise. So you want to do it actively. Don't just read over notes. You need to work with the content and actively practice essay planning and writing, making sure you cover every topic. So for example, if you use the Politics Explained essay plans or essay plans you've got yourself, don't just read over them constantly. Look at the title, don't look at the plan. Try and write it out or say it out without knowing, and then compare what you had to what's left in there. If there's any key points that you missed out, maybe put them on flashcards to kind of go over and practice before the exam. And it's about like rechecking them. I think a really good way to do when you're going over plans is do that and combine that with writing introductions, because that practices your introductions straight away. So when you go into the exam, you know what you're doing straight away in terms of planning and writing introduction, and it also forces you to come up with a judgment. So it's a really good way to kind of combine just learning knowledge. Also, okay, the exam you need to analyze, you need to evaluate, crucially to do well and get the marks you want to get. Yeah, so I think it's also practicing using the kind of essay plans, the Politics Explained ones, so the ones on the website, to practice other questions as well. It's not like these only 20 or 22 questions are the only ones that come up, even though last year there were a lot of the questions were pretty similar to the ones in the plans. But there's lots of different questions that come up as well. You see at the bottom of each plan, use this question to practice, and also look at past paper questions as well. Just these kind of more difficult questions, difficultly worded questions. You don't want to go in just being able to answer the questions in the plan, in your plans. You need to be able to adapt it to different questions, especially as a lot of them are going to be source questions as well. and differently worded questions. I'd also think kind of practicing writing essays is really good. You want to know your timings really, really well before the exam, so do a practice mock. Um, and yeah, do some questions under time conditions, and yeah, just practice your writing, and any key points you've got from your teacher in the past, or maybe from the videos I've done. Look at them and think, okay, let's just finally go over essay technique and try and analyze it yourself, or if you can get your teacher to have a look, just so you know, okay, these are the final key points I'm going to look at. In terms of some advice on essay writing and approaching the exam questions, working out, as I said, the first thing is work out what you can do in terms of timings is really important. So you don't want to go into the exam guessing. You want to know that, okay, for the 30 mark source question, this is how long I'm going to spend on it. The ideal is doing 3 paragraphs for the source questions and the essay questions. But you might realize if you do a mock beforehand, practice yourself, okay, I don't have time for that. And if you don't have time for that, you don't want to be not finishing a question. It's much better just, okay, decide, okay, I'm going to be doing 2 paragraphs for one question or 2 paragraphs for both question, and actually answering and getting to a conclusion, having analysis and evaluation, not just kind of 1 or 2 paragraphs. So you need to work out your timings. And as I said, it's better to do 2 and finish the essay than to do 3 paragraphs. Make sure you directly answer the question in introduction and that all your arguments specifically refer to the question. So the most important part of an introduction for me. So you want to introduce your paragraphs and make it clear to the examiner you kind of know the topic and this is how my essay is going to look, and that can be either through introducing the arguments on one side and the other, or by saying something like, this essay will analyse whether devolution has been a success by looking at its impact on democracy, its impact on the unity of the UK, and its impact on governance. So that's kind of setting out your 3 themes in your 3 paragraphs. I think that works really well. What you want after that, after setting out the paragraphs, because you want a judgment, you want a clear answer to the question. That doesn't have to be completely on one side or completely on the other, but it needs to be clear and decisive answer. And you really want to justify that and explain it, because then you're picking up some evaluation marks straight away. You're showing the examiner straight away that I know the answer to the question. This is how I know my answer. I've thought about it, and that'll run through the whole essay. And again, adding some nuance to that can be a really good way to push up to that A star. And it doesn't always have to be completely one side or completely the other. But it does need to be decisive and it does need to be justified. Also, making sure all your arguments specifically refer to the question. The best way to do that, and this is in the main paragraph, the best way to do that is signposting. So say, as I said, we have that devolution question. Evaluate the view that devolution has been a success. And your first first paragraph, is on its impact on democracy. You should probably be starting with one key argument that devolution has had a positive impact on democracy is this, and then you want to specifically say exactly what the argument is. So you're directly answering the question, just use those terms of the question. You want to use those terms of the question in your mini conclusions as well. Overall, the most persuasive argument is that devolution has had a positive impact on democracy. Does that make sense? So it's just really using the terms of the question. You might think that's simplistic. It's not. It's good writing. It's good, clear writing. Next thing is in terms of evaluations, and I think this is really important to say, the best arguments and judgments are the ones you have thought about, right? What they want you to do in A-level politics is be able to look at a key question and answer it, right? You don't want to just, okay, look at a question and think, oh, what's the easiest to argue? I'm going to go for this side or I'm going to go for this side, and just pick one. Think about the question and think, okay, what is your argument? What do you think and why? And that's how you're going to push up to the top grades, because that's when you're going to get good evaluation, because you'll be able to fully explain it because you've thought of it. So it's like decisively answering the question and really thinking about it and being able to explain why you think that. And that will really help you come up with more evaluation marks. Next thing, make sure you're analysing after examples. Don't just bring examples in and then leave it and go on to a next point. Pretty much say something like this shows after the example and link it back to the point. So that's where you're getting those analysis marks rather than just the knowledge marks. And then a final kind of point before I'll talk a little about source questions after actually, but a final key point is about planning essays. So I think your ideal when you're planning an essay is to think of 3 themes or criteria as topics for the paragraphs, right? So for example, evaluate the view that devolution has been a success. As I said, you look at 3 key ways that can be judged: its impact on democracy, its impact on governance, and its impact on unity of the UK. Or evaluate the view that Blair's constitutional reforms had a positive impact on the UK. You look at 3 of the key reforms: devolution, Human Rights Act, House of Lords reform. Or for example, evaluate the view that first past the post isn't the most effective electoral system in the UK. 3 criteria to judge that: voter choice, representation slash proportionality, type of government created. And these are things you should be thinking about and planning before the exam as well. So these kind of, ideally you want to come up with these 3 themes or criteria. And then you have for and against within those, and then the kind of judgments in relation to those form your overall answer to the question. And that can be, for example, overall devolution has been a success for democracy and unity of the UK, but hasn't positively impacted democracy. This being said, overall it's still been a success. So that you can kind of, it doesn't have to be every single one answering the same thing as well, as long as you can do that effectively and kind of practice that effectively. So the first thing, yeah, so that's your first idea. You want the 3 themes if you can. Sometimes that doesn't work for questions. Sometimes, especially if they're questions you haven't prepared very well or haven't seen before, or haven't seen similar ones, it's quite difficult to think of effective themes. And in that regard, then what you kind of want to go for is, okay, what are some arguments on one side, what are some arguments on the other, and then match them up well. And they need to be matched up well so there's effective debates within the paragraphs. And the final thing I said I'd talk about is source questions. Effectively, I think a good way to think about the source questions in Edexcel is, okay, what are they looking for from a source question? What they're looking for from a source question is for you to look at a key question in relation to politics in the UK, understand the key arguments on either side, like kind of recognise and understand them, and be able to explain them, and come to a judgment. Crucially, they're not looking for you to bring in your own points. You don't want to do kind of 2 paragraphs from the source and then one of your own. You're not picking up any marks of that. What they want is recognize the arguments in the source and be able to explain them. And that's why every argument has to start from the source. So one key argument in the source is this. Then you explain it. Explain what it's saying, bring in an example, which can be from the source if there's one, or that's where you can bring in your own knowledge. But it's the examples to show the point that the source was introduced. So just don't be bringing in your own points effectively. It all has to start from the source. And obviously you're evaluating as normal which side of the argument you think is the most persuasive. But yeah, make sure that those points start from the source and you don't try and introduce your own points. And yeah, and just make sure you're adapting to each particular question. This applies to the sources and the essay questions as well. Don't just go in with, okay, this is how I'm going to answer every question, because it might be phrased slightly differently, and that might require you to do a slightly different answer. So it's about practicing that and thinking on your feet, as well as being really prepared. Okay, so a lot of these examples you can use for UK politics and UK government, obviously using them in different ways to explain different points. But the first few we're going to have a look at, or the first kind of 5 or 6, I think, are mainly UK politics focused. And the first one of these is the Public Order Act, which was passed by the government in May 2023 in response to the UK government's concerns over highly disruptive protest tactics used by pressure groups such as Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. So this could be crucially used for pressure groups and for rights in context in the first exam. You could also use it as an example of the government passing legislation in the second exam, for example. But effectively introduce new offences such as locking on, so attaching yourself to objects, and interfering with national infrastructure, so including the roads around Parliament and protesting around those, and made them punishable by imprisonment or unlimited fines. And it was kind of specifically designed to limit the effectiveness of pressure groups that had used such tactics, specifically Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion. And this can be used effectively to show, as an example of the infringement on rights and the right to protest in the UK, and how the government is threatening rights, and also how government action is limiting the effectiveness of outsider pressure groups. And there's an example here of the Act being used in October 2023 to limit the effectiveness of Just Stop Oil and outsider pressure group. So they were doing a slow march around Parliament Square, and then the police kind of swiftly after they started arrested them. And that was justified as kind of because they were interfering with national infrastructure, which is the area around Parliament. So that shows how government legislation, the Public Order Act, which has been introduced, is threatening rights in the UK and the action of pressure groups. The next example then we're going to have a look at is in relation to lobbying. And this was quite a prominent lobbying scandal in late 2023 in relation to Scott Benton, who was a former Conservative MP for Blackpool South. Recently, the Blackpool South by-election was because he resigned. He got replaced by a Labour MP. But effectively, in late 2023, he was caught in an undercover operation, kind of sting operation by the Times, where they kind of framed themselves as a fake gambling company. And he was kind of they proposed to pay him £4,000 a month to ask parliamentary questions on their behalf and also leak confidential policy papers for the company. And he was filmed undercover agreeing to this. As a result, he was stripped from the Conservative Party and suspended from the House of Commons, which resulted in a by-election where he was removed. But crucially, it's a good example to show that potentially lobbying can really damage democracy in the UK, and that some MPs are very open to being influenced. The next example, and maybe the most high-profile example, and you can use it for such a range of topics in UK politics and government. So this is the Safety of Rwanda Act, and you can use it in a range of topics. So you can look at it specifically in relation to rights in context in UK politics, as well as Conservative Party policy and Labour Party policy. So if you look at the example packs, you'll see how Labour oppose it and what they kind of suggest instead. In UK government, it's really important in relation to the Supreme Court, and you can also bring it in as an example of government legislation and look at how the House of Lords effectively stood up against it a number of times before eventually backing down and recognising their lack of democratic legitimacy. So you can look at it in terms of comparison between the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and there's various topics that you can bring it into as well. This kind of particular part of it, and they're all explained in the example packs, so how you could use it for different topics. This specific one is for rights in context, but we'll touch on all of them effectively, specifically in relation to the Supreme Court. So effectively, I thought it's useful just because it's a really complicated example to explain it in terms of a timeline. So the initial act and agreement is that in April 2022, the Rwanda plan was first articulated. So they formed a partnership, the UK government with Rwanda, and intended to relocate asylum seekers who arrived in the UK illegally to Rwanda, where their asylum claims would be processed. And that was intended to be a deterrent against illegal crossings. Faced significant legal hurdles, particularly in November 2023, when the Supreme Court found the policy unlawful due to risks of refoulement, which is effectively these refugees being forcibly returned to a country, from their home country, where they're likely to face persecution for a number of reasons, whether that country uses torture, whether that country has a very poor rights record and persecution of LGBT individuals. So there's lots of different reasons, but they effectively judged that Rwanda's asylum system was very inadequate, and as a result, there were big risks of refoulement, and it wasn't a safe country under international law, and therefore it went against the UK's human rights obligations. So the UK government setting up this policy went against the Human Rights Act and the 1951 Refugee Convention, which the UK is party to. And effectively, because this wasn't a law that they'd introduced yet, it was an action, and the Supreme Court effectively struck that down. So the UK government couldn't continue with this because with judicial review, the Supreme Court had struck it down. It's not like a law where they can only declare it incompatible. With UK government actions and policies, they can strike them down. In response, the UK and Rwanda drafted a new treaty, which included more robust guarantees about the treatment of individuals in Rwanda, and they hoped that this would kind of define it as a safe country. But the key thing they did was pass the Safety of Rwanda Bill, or now the Safety of Rwanda Act, in April 2024. And effectively, what the Act does is states that Rwanda should be considered by the courts a safe country for asylum seekers, and the international law, so the Refugee Convention, but also the Human Rights Act, which is also the European Convention on Human Rights. So both international law and domestic law, so the Human Rights Act, must be put aside to allow for the deportation of asylum seekers. So the Supreme Court must look at this, must effectively not apply the Human Rights Act as law in relation to this bill, in relation to this act, in relation to people being deported to Rwanda, and must legally consider Rwanda a safe country, so that there could be these deportations. So it can be seen in a lot of ways as really, on one hand, the first ruling could be seen as how the Supreme Court could protect rights, but the fact that the UK government effectively then went and passed a law saying that law shouldn't be applied, human rights law, international law shouldn't be applied in relation to this, so that we can do our policy, shows that the UK government has a lot of power in relation to the Supreme Court, because they can, if the Supreme Court strikes down one of their actions as it goes against the law, the UK Parliament can simply change the law, and it really also shows how rights are threatened in the UK, and effectively, it in this case, because Rwanda could no longer be considered they said that Rwanda is a safe consent country and that other law must be put aside. Judicial review, the chance of judicial review for individuals in this case was removed as well. So that can be seen as really going against rights in the UK. So yeah, you'll see in the different examples in the example packs how I show how you can use this for different parts of the course. But that's a general explanation of the Rwanda Act, the Safety of Rwanda Act. Okay, so the next example we're going to have a look at is a couple of Labour's recent economic policies. So firstly, they're kind of focused on securonomics and fiscal responsibility and ditching of the Green Prosperity Plan, and also their moderate taxation policies. So the first thing we want to look at is Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves, who's really, and her Starmer and the leadership in general, have really sought to kind of place a real emphasis on the fact that Labour will be fiscally responsible when they come into the next government. So they'd be really pro-business, and rather having major investment and change promoted by Corbyn, they're kind of really focusing on competence and stability in the economy. So Reeves has called this approach securonomics. And this includes avoiding running a budget deficit, implementing a fiscal lock, and really kind of emphasizing measures to maintain economic stability. And part of this can be seen, this emphasis on fiscal stability can be seen in the fact that they ditched their previous £28 billion a year Green Prosperity Plan. And they justified this by saying they were prioritising financial stability. And in a way, this can be seen as very similar to New Labour. A move away from Corbyn and old Labour, because they're moving away from spending commitments and moving towards being kind of more pro-business, emphasising kind of economic competence rather than real change and pursuit of equality effectively. This can also be seen in the moderate taxation policies. So Starmer, when he'd come to become Labour leader, had originally said that he'd increase taxation for those earning over 80,000. That's now been moved away from. So effectively, the Labour Party is saying they have no intention to increase corporation tax, income taxes, or national insurance once elected. And that's a clear strategy to move to the centre ground, pick up middle class voters, and move away from this image of a high tax, high spending party that they kind of regained under Corbyn. And instead, they're emphasising they'll raise money through loopholes, such as in relation to non-doms. In reality, that's not going to raise anywhere near as much as tax rises, but it works quite well as a political strategy. The next example we're going to have a look at is in relation to Reform UK, which is a really useful example for political parties and minor parties in the party system, but also you can really use in relation to electoral systems as well, and the idea of the spoiler effect. So over the past year, reforms significantly increased in popularity and attention. So originally emerged from the Brexit Party, which was started by Nigel Farage, and that kind of effectively emerged, or kind of was a legacy of UKIP previously, and it's kind of positioning itself as a right-wing populist party, advocating for tighter immigration controls, lower taxes, revision of the UK's net zero plans in relation to climate change, and they're effectively looking to pressure, or they are on the right of the Conservative Party, and looking to make sure that the Conservative Party continues to be on the right and taking voters, or attracting support from voters who are really dismayed with the Conservative Party. And it's kind of really resonated with 2019 Conservative voters who are disillusioned with the current party. So a YouGov poll in early 2024 stated that 21% of 2019 Tory voters said they intend to back Reform UK. It's chaired by Richard Tice, who is a key member of the Brexit Party, and gained a significant boost in March 2024 when Conservative Party MP and former Deputy Chair Lee Anderson defected to Reform. Though the party is, as with a lot of minor parties under first past the post, right, is very unlikely to win many seats itself under first past the post, it's currently polling at just under 10% of the vote, and therefore has the potential to take key votes away from the Conservative Party, enabling Labour to win more seats. And it's therefore playing an important role as a result of that in forcing the Conservative Party to shift to the right so they don't lose as many votes as possible to Reform. And crucially, this demonstrates how minor parties can have a big influence in elections, in influencing policy, but also election outcomes through the spoiler effect. So when there's a minor party that draws the votes away from a major party, so in this case Reform and the Conservative Party, that can cause that major party to lose an election. Obviously, there's lots of other reasons why the Conservative Party might lose the next election, but this could be one of them, and it will help the other major party, the Labour Party, to win it. And that also explains how the minor parties can influence policy, because the threat of this spoiler effect, they influence major parties' policies. So they're forcing the Conservative Party more to the right, or making sure they continue to be far to the right, so they don't lose voters to reform, which is a key threat to them in the next election. Their success and spoiler effect can be seen in 3 recent by-elections, particularly in the Blackpool South, where they won 16.9% of the vote, but also in earlier ones in February, in Wellingborough and Kingswood, where they won 13% and 10.4% of the vote, respectively. The next key example we're going to have a look at, which you can use in relation to minor parties, in relation to devolution, is the SNP's declining popularity. So since 2023, it's seen a notable decline in popularity, influenced by a range of factors. So big thing was a big party funding scandal that included the arrest of Nicola Sturgeon's husband, and SNP chief executive Peter Morrell, as well as the resignation of Sturgeon as party leader and first minister. That led to declining trust in the party, and also overshadowed the kind of next SNP leader, Humza Yousaf, who resigned in April 2024 after a breakdown in government. But he was a very unpopular leader who failed to kind of unite the party, and his approval ratings were consistently lower than Sturgeon's were. There are a lot of divisions within the party over gender, and how strongly the party should push for independence during his leadership. The SNP has also declined in popularity due to its failures in terms of governance, and this is in much more detail in the UK government example pack, and also in the notes and the plans. But effectively, they've kind of fallen behind the UK, England in particular, in terms of management of the US, in terms of waiting times, and also in terms of key education, success of the education system, particularly reflected in the PISA rankings. Labour's capitalised on these SNP setbacks and now looks to win quite a lot of seats in the next election in Scotland, which will really help it win the election as a whole in the UK. Now projected that they'll win around 24 seats compared to the SNP's 27, when the SNP's dominated in the last 3 elections in Scotland. And that's a really significant shift. So building on that a little bit, we've also got the breakdown of the Scottish Government in April 2024, which I referenced a little bit. Effectively, in late April 2024, the Scottish Government, which had been a coalition between the SNP and the Greens, broke down. Yousaf decided to end the coalition agreement after the Greens strongly criticised the SNP for abandoning a key climate change target and pausing the prescription of puberty blockers to new patients at Scotland's only gender services clinic for young people. As a result, the Greens supported a no confidence motion against Yousaf, who soon after resigned as party leader and as first minister. And this could be used in relation to kind of political parties and declining popularity of the SNP, but also in relation to electoral systems, because one of the key benefits of first past the post, or key arguments for first past the post, is that it produces strong governments, and that's compared to coalitions that often occur under more proportional systems such as AMS. And this is a really good example of a more proportional electoral system leading to coalition that leads to more instability in government. The final key example we're going to have a look at in relation to UK politics is the post office scandal, and how in early 2024 ITV's reporting of it led to really key policy impacts and a lot greater focus on it. So effectively, the Post Office Horizon scandal involved wrongful convictions of numerous post office operators based on flawed software, and it received limited coverage under the surface until it was thrust into the limelight earlier this year by a compelling ITV documentary and subsequent kind of detailed investigations by Newsnight. So it had received previous attention, and there was an ongoing public inquiry, but this media attention and public pressure as a consequence really created change and influence policy by putting pressure on the UK government. So as a result of the programme and this increased focus, the UK government announced a new and improved compensation scheme for the wrongfully convicted sub-postmasters, including not only compensations for the financial losses, but also personal distress and reputational damage. It also saw the government launching a new kind of public inquiry in relation to it, and set up the Post Office and Horizon Committee to do so. And that really shows how investigative journalism and the media are really pivotal in holding the government to account between elections, representing kind of minorities and underrepresented groups, and can be really seen as important to a pluralist democracy. And crucially show how the media can have a big impact in UK politics, especially between elections. Okay, so the next key examples we're going to have a look at are in relation to UK government. And the first of these is the extension of devolution in England, in particular in relation to city regions, local mayors, and regional assemblies. So in March 2023, the UK government introduced two trailblazer devolution deals for Greater Manchester and the West Midlands. They didn't grant legislative control, which Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland have, but they did give them substantial administrative control and funding autonomy, so even greater control than they had previously. So they devolved control over post-19 skills education, affordable housing programs, and infrastructure investment, and therefore kind of overall kind of a real focus on regional economic development. And that built on the existing control both areas had over transport and the influence Greater Manchester has in terms of health and social care. And this is kind of described as level 4 devolution. In the 2023 autumn statement later, 4 new devolution settlements were introduced, including in the northeast. So granted it to the northeast, Greater Lincolnshire, Holland, East Yorkshire, and Lancashire. Northeast was particularly significant as it was granted the same powers as Greater Manchester and the West Midlands. This can be seen as kind of democratic, as it's moving democracy closer to the people, allowing them to represent their local area. It can be seen as undemocratic, though, because this is the same devolved area that was rejected in the 2004 election with a big no vote of 78%, when there hasn't been much public support for it necessarily, or major public pressure for it. It's largely a top-down policy. But now the key point now is that the kind of English devolution, even if it's not legislative control, and you can definitely talk about that as a limit, now covers the majority of the English population. So 64% of the English population and 90% of the population in the north. So there's really key constitutional changes and extensions to devolution in England. Okay, the next key example we're going to have a look at is David Cameron's appointment as Foreign Secretary. You can use this for a wide range of things. So you can use it in UK politics in relation to a democratic deficit, because he was kind of appointed as a Lord to a really important government position and made a Lord to do so by Rishi Sunak. You can use that in relation to the UK government and the Prime Minister's powers of patronage. The fact he was able to make him a Lord shows the extent of the Prime Minister's power of patronage. And you can also use it in relation to the reasons why ministers are selected, which we're going to have a look at here. Because effectively it can be argued that Cameron was appointed as Foreign Secretary due to his experience and competence, showing why that's a key factor in how ministers are selected. So effectively, as I said, he was kind of made Foreign Secretary in November 2023 by Sunak, and he was made a peer in order to do so. And this broke the convention that the key offices of state are traditionally filled by members of the House of Commons. So highlighting the extent of the power of patronage and how it could kind of bypass parliamentary norms. His appointment of Cameron shows how experience and competence are important to Prime Ministers appointing their cabinets. So he's important foreign policy experience and a global reputation from his time as Prime Minister, which kind of allow him to have more influence for the UK on the global stage in comparison to the previous Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly. And he's used that kind of diplomatic connections to increase the influence of the UK. For example, Cameron played a key role in coordinating airstrikes with the US on pro-Iranian forces in Yemen. And this also links into the amount of control that Sunak's given to ministers. And this is another example here. You'll see in the example pack that Cameron and Hunt in particular have been given significant control. Final way we can use it is effectively, it can be seen as an attempt by Sunak to kind of represent and regain support from the One Nation faction of the Conservative Party, which Cameron was a key member of, especially voters are losing in the blue wall to the Lib Dems in particular. The next example we're going to have a look at is the Criminal Justice Bill as an example of a successful rebellion. So kind of in April 2024 and in May as well, it was reported that the government paused its plans to introduce the Criminal Justice Act due to at least 40 Conservative MPs threatening to rebel and defeat the bill. And this was because the bill included giving the police the power to forcibly remove on rough sleepers and introduce nuisance prevention orders against those who create an excessive smell or are looking like they're intending to sleep on the streets. And effectively, a lot of Conservative MPs and obviously a lot of members of the public saw this as a really, effectively as criminalising, recriminalising rough sleeping in the UK, and saw it as a pretty despicable suggestion. And high-profile benchers such as Sir Ian Duncan Smith and Caroline Noakes indicated their intention to rebel. And this shows how the threat of a rebellion can effectively defeat a bill before there's even a vote on it, as the government backs down knowing it will lose. And even though the current government under Sunak hasn't lost many, pretty much only lost one vote, which we're going to have a look at next actually, they can be defeated effectively and renege on a policy because they know they're going to be defeated. So yeah, the next example we're going to have a look at is this one government defeat under Sunak, and that was on the 5th of December when 22 Conservative MPs supported a Labour amendment to the Victims and Prisoners Bill, aimed at speeding up compensation for victims of the infected blood scandal, and they rebelled against a 3-line Conservative whip to do so, but were successful in passing the amendment. And this called for the establishment of a body to administer compensation within 3 months of passing the Victims and Prisoners Bill. So this is the first and, as of yet, only defeat of the government under Sunak, and as a result, the Victims and Prisoners Bill has actually, as of yet, failed to be passed. And it can also be shown as an example of MP constituency link, and this is in more detail in the UK politics example pack. But the rebels were influenced by strong local movements and victims of the scandal in their constituencies. So Caroline Noakes, for example, I think she's in Southampton. I don't know the particular name of the constituency it's in the pack, but she was influenced by a strong local movement there and voted against it. So it's an example of the MP constituency link as well. Okay, the final key example we're going to have a look at is Suella Braverman's sacking as an example of collective ministerial responsibility. So in November 2023, Suella Braverman was sacked as Home Secretary following a controversial opinion piece in the Times about the police's handling of pro-Palestinian protests. So she accused the police of playing favourites and describing the protests as hate marches. Braverman's piece was published without being reviewed and approved by Downing Street, and effectively it wasn't approved Downing Street messaging, and it therefore violated the ministerial code, and her statements are seen as a direct challenge to Sunak's authority. And effectively, as a result, Sunak sacked Suella Braverman for breaking collective ministerial responsibility. And this can be seen as a kind of an example of collective ministerial responsibility being important and being enforced. But on the other hand, it's important to recognise that beforehand, Braverman had made a number of comments that kind of were very controversial and weren't directly aligned with government messaging without being sacked. So she called homelessness a lifestyle choice, saying grooming gangs were almost all British Pakistani, despite evidence from the Home Office, from her own department, directly contradicting that, and saying that multiculturalism had failed without being sacked. So on the other hand, it can be argued that actually the eventual decision to sack Braverman was more a consequence of growing public and media pressure rather than the ministerial code being enforced. So you can use that example effectively for both sides, and doing that in an essay is a really good way to pick up lots of analysis marks. So yeah, as I said, loads more examples from the last year in the example packs on the Politics Explained website. They can also find lots of essay plans for those first 2 papers and notes to really help you in that first exam. Let me know if you've got any questions in the comment section below, any questions or comments, and I'll get back to you. And yeah, apart from that, best of luck in the first exam,